All right, I think we're all set to go. So I'm very excited that we have David Jacobs today as our distinguished speaker in the AI series. So David is an AI scientist at Meta. He's on leave from the University of Maryland, where he's a professor in the Department of Computer Science. And he also has a joint appointment in UMIACS. UMIACS is a little like our BU Hariri Institute. So it's sort of the research arm there that helps connect people doing AI research with each other and with people in application areas. So I've known David for a long time. He's done very seminal work in 3D. He's going to talk about 3D again today. Back then, before deep learning, it was all looking at physical properties, Lambertian reflections, shape classification. So David's done a lot of work in that area. About 10 years ago, his team was the first to develop the web app for plant identification, which was absolutely fantastic back then. And David has also worked on bird identification. So that was all quite difficult to do pre-deep learning. And then once deep learning came into our field, David has made the change and done lots of work there too. Face analysis and lots of 3D work. So I'm curious to hear more about how to leverage synthetic data. I know a lot of the people in the audience, our students, are looking at that too, trying to figure out how can we leverage data to help train these data-hungry deep models. So I'm very excited. So if people have questions, please use the question and answer feature on this webinar to type them in so we can look at them at the end of the talk. All right, thanks very much. And David, we're excited to have you talk now.
Oh, thanks a lot, Margaret. Yeah, so I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. As Margaret said, I'm on leave this year at Meta. And you might have heard that there's been a lot going on at Meta this year. There were some massive layoffs on Wednesday, and so they didn't want anybody traveling this week. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to come up to Boston, but I'm glad to be here virtually. And so, yeah, I'm going to talk about some recent work I've been doing with my students on 3D reconstruction. This is work over the last few years. And the main problem that we address is that it's very difficult to get labeled data for 3D reconstruction problems that's real labeled data. It's easy to get synthetic data that's labeled. And so I'm going to talk about how we can use synthetic data to get good performance on real images. And the title says lightweight reconstruction. And what I really mean by that is that in the work in this talk, there's not a lot of effort that needs to go into acquiring images for the reconstruction. So this is mainly going to be about reconstruction from a single image or from a few images that are pretty easy to take. So, So let me start off by giving some examples of what I mean by 3D reconstruction. And this is all work I've been doing with my students. So, for example, you might want to take an image of a face and recover all of the 3D properties of the face, including the surface normals, which are shown on my left here as color-coded surface normals, and lighting, which is shown in the middle by rendering the face under this lighting condition without albedo, so you can sort of see the shading from the lighting. And also the albedo, which is how light or dark every point on the face is. And so the idea is to take this image and extract from it all of these surface properties. And this allows you to reconstruct the face, render it with new lighting or from new viewpoints. We're also interested in extracting human shape and pose from a single image. So given an image like this, you'd like to be able to figure out the pose of this person, the position of their legs and arms, and roughly the shape of the person, how big they are. We've also worked on this with animals. This is some earlier work where pre-deep learning, where we were relying on also some feature correspondences. That's what these red dots show. And the idea is to take an image like this and recover the 3D pose of the cat. Here's another example from animals where we want to be able to take an image of something like a hippopotamus and build a 3D reconstruction of its shape and position. And this is a good example that illustrates how incredibly difficult it can be sometimes to get lots of labeled data. It's very difficult to take a bunch of hippopotamuses and measure their 3D shape and use that as training data. So we want to be able to work with limited amounts of training data for this problem. Here's an example of monocular depth estimation, where you take a single image of an outdoor scene and try to determine the depth of every point in the image. Here's an example of reconstruction from an indoor scene. So this is a similar kind of problem to the first face problem I showed you, where we have an image and we want to get the normal albedo and lighting. But this is more challenging because 3D scenes can be much more complex than individual faces. Okay, so that's just a quick view of some of the problems that we've been working on. And let me just give sort of the key ideas behind this work. So first of all, this kind of reconstruction from a single image is an extremely ill-posed problem. That is, there are many 3D configurations of objects or scenes that could produce these images if we don't know anything about the world. And so in order to solve these problems, we have to have really strong, effective priors on the way the world is. We have to know about the shape of faces. We have to know about the shape of human bodies and use that knowledge combined with an image to build a reconstruction. And so, of course, these days when we talk about building a prior of the world, what we mean is we're going to use machine learning and generally deep learning. And so what deep learning is really doing is it's learning about these regularities in the world. It's learning about the shape of real objects. So it can provide a prior that, combined with an image, produces a good posterior reconstruction of the object or the scene. So to use deep learning, the most straightforward way is to get lots of labeled training data and to train a neural network to do reconstruction. And that's been extremely successful in problems like classification or even segmentation. But for 3D reconstruction, it's really hard to acquire labels for real images. So if I show you an image of a face and I say, what's the lighting in that image, you're actually not very good at figuring that out. If I show you a complex scene and it's even harder to find the lighting, it's difficult for somebody to label the depth or the surface normals and describe the way the materials reflect light. And so some of this you can do in a laboratory if you carefully measure things, but then it's not, you don't have quite real data, you have lab data, and it tends to be very painstaking and expensive to measure these kinds of things in a lab. And so it would be better if we can build methods that don't rely on having labels for real images. On the other hand, it's really easy to get labels for synthetic images. So computer graphics works really well now. We can render quite realistic looking images of scenes or faces. And when we use computer graphics, we sort of automatically have all the labels. We know the 3D structure of the objects we're rendering. We know what the lighting is. We know what the materials are. We know everything. But it's still not quite good enough. These synthetic images are still not quite real. There's a domain gap between the synthetic and real. And so if we just train on synthetic images and perform reconstruction on real images, we tend not to get the best results. And so one of the themes of this talk is suggesting a few different ways that we can merge real and synthetic information. And I'll also talk about some approaches that are lightweight in the sense of using very few images and can produce high resolution reconstructions. I'll talk more about that near the end of the talk. Okay, so the first piece of work I'm going to talk about is this work on 3D reconstruction of faces. And this was done with Soumyadeep Sengupta. He was the lead on this. He was then my graduate student. He's now just started as a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we got a lot of help from two of my former students, Anju Kanazawa, who's now a professor at Berkeley, and Carlos Castilla, who's now a research scientist at Amazon. And so the problem that we're trying to solve in this work is to take an image and train a neural network using synthetic and real data so that we can recover the surface normals, the shading, which is a combination of the structure and the lighting, and the albedos. And the main idea here is that if we can recover normal shading and albedo, we can then use simple rendering to reconstruct the original image. And we're going to use that as part of the learning process. And we can also use this to relight images, for example, or to change the viewpoint in the images, as I'll show. Okay, so the main issue is that we want to train using unlabeled real data, and we're going to do this with a photometric reconstruction loss. So the idea here is that if our network produces normals, shading, and albedo, we can combine these together to reconstruct the image. And so we have this constraint that the surface properties that we derive from the image, the normal, albedo, and shading, should be consistent with the image. If we use them to render the image, that should produce a new image that's similar to the input image. So this is a reconstruction loss. And this is the main way that we're going to use real images to train our networks. The problem with this on its own is that the reconstruction is not unique. There's a lot of ambiguity. There are a lot of different ways I can reconstruct a 3D shape that would produce this image, and a lot of them are wrong. And so, since the result is ambiguous, the idea is to use synthetic data to disambiguate this. So the synthetic data is going to provide us with information, with prior information about the shapes and surface properties of faces, and we're going to use that information to guide the reconstruction. And we do this using a network architecture that reflects a physical rendering model. So in the architecture, we have blocks that are recovering normals, albedos, estimating the lighting, in this case, based on the image and the normal and albedo. It turns out that it's easier to, lighting is difficult to estimate, but it's easier to estimate if you have an estimate of the normal and the albedo. And then we can recover the normal and albedo and shading and combine them together to reconstruct an image. Okay, so if we just use the reconstruction loss, we could train a network to recover all of these properties in a way that makes sure that the recovered properties match the input image. And this relies on a very simple rendering model, what we call a direct renderer, which is very simple in the fact that it ignores a lot of real world properties of rendering. So the rendered image is just based on assuming that every light source sees every surface property, so it doesn't handle shadows. This turns out not to be too big a problem with faces because we are ignoring the shadows the nose casts on the face, but faces are pretty almost convex, and so the shadows are not too big a deal. We're only handling Lambertian objects, and it's been shown that actually Lambertian objects provide pretty good approximation to faces. So these are objects that are just diffuse without a lot of really shiny specularities. And so we're going to miss, faces can be a little shiny, and we're going to miss that. But compared to things like metal objects, the shininess is not really that big a deal. And we're going to use a very simple model of lighting. And this is actually a model that Ronan Bosme and I applied to computer vision a long time ago. And basically, this assumes that incoming light intensity can be represented as a function of direction. So every point on the face, if you look in the same direction, it's going to see the same light. This essentially assumes that the light isn't too close to the face relative to the size of the face, and that's generally okay because faces are pretty small usually compared to the distance to any light source. And we can think of the reflected light also as a function of direction. And then we're able to prove that the reflected light is actually the incoming light convolved with a filter, which is just the max of 0 and a cosine function. And this is because for Lambertian objects, the reflected light just depends on the cosine of the angle between the surface and the incoming light, except that if the surface is facing away from the light, there is 0 light reflected, not a negative light. Right? So when the cosine is negative, we really just have 0 light. And so there's this very simple relationship between reflected light and incoming light for simple objects like faces. And this filter, this max of 0 and a cosine, acts like a low-pass filter. And so we can show that for objects like faces, only really the low-frequency components of the light affect the image that's being produced. And we do this using something like the convolution theorem for 2D signals, but these are signals on the surface of a sphere, so it's a little different. But basically, we can show that there are only 9 low-frequency components of the light that have to be represented, and so that's how we represent the lighting in this problem. So the main point here is just that for simple objects like faces, when we want to reconstruct them and we want to reconstruct the lighting, we can represent the lighting with just 9 parameters. Okay, so if we do this and just use a reconstruction loss, so we train a network to only to reconstruct normal albedo and shading and make sure that the reconstructed image matches the input image, we get results like this, which are very bad. So this is the surface normals, and they're basically flat. And so approximately what the network has done is it's reconstructed the face as a photograph of a face, a flat object with an image of the face plastered on it. And so the albedo that's being reconstructed contains all of the shading information. And we haven't recovered anything 3-dimensional. And this is because the reconstruction is ambiguous here, and this is a perfectly rational reconstruction. It's just completely wrong. So in order to overcome this ambiguity, we're going to combine synthetic and real data. And so the idea is we first take our network and pre-train it on synthetic data where we have labels. And this gives us a network that we can apply to real images and produce a kind of pseudo ground truth. So if we just train on synthetic data, we don't get the greatest results, but we get something that's more or less right. That's kind of in the general, it's going to look face-like. It's going to produce things that look face-like. They're not going to be, they're going to be a little blurry. They're not going to be very high resolution. And so the idea is to use this pseudo data, these pseudo labels, but only weight them a little bit. So then we're going to train a network which relies primarily on the same reconstruction loss we had before, but it's also going to use these pseudo labels a little bit, and those are going to disambiguate the reconstruction. So if there's two different ways of reconstructing the image that are almost as good in terms of the reconstruction loss, the synthetic data is going to push the reconstruction in the direction of something that matches our 3D priors on face shape. And so when we do that using synthetic data, we get a much better reconstruction. So here the surface normals show a lot more three-dimensionality to them. The albedos don't have this shading information here. The skin is pretty uniform albedo, and that's what we get with this reconstruction. And more of these lighting effects are pushed into the shading and out of the albedo. Okay, so this was a few years ago. We compared this to some state-of-the-art methods at the time. And the main thing to observe here is just that we got much finer detail in our reconstructions. So these are our reconstructions. This was a contemporaneous method. And the real data seems to be necessary to get really high resolution results. We can also evaluate these methods on their ability to do lighting identification. So to do this, we use this data set, which was taken in the lab of people under different lighting conditions. And we showed that our method is able to recover lighting much more accurately than other methods. This is just a laboratory test, but it's a way of quantitatively evaluating how good our reconstruction of lighting is. And there's also some data sets that have 3D surface normals, ground truth. And for those also, we are able to show that we recover 3D surface normals much better than competing methods at the time. Okay, and in this case, I mean, we're comparing to some methods that only recover lighting or only recover surface normals. And it's also our sense that recovering all properties of the scene, of the face, produces better results than trying to recover just the lighting or just the normals. And part of this is because we have this reconstruction loss that we can use when we recover all of the properties of the face. Okay, and then we can take this recovered surface normals and use them to build 3D reconstructions of the face. And this is work that my student Daniel Lichi did at the start of his PhD thesis, his PhD work. Okay, so the key takeaway here is that we can use reconstruction loss and self-supervision to train on real data, but there's some gaps there. There's some ambiguity, and we can disambiguate using synthetic data. And so we're not relying too much on the synthetic data. We're just relying on it at a very coarse level to nudge our reconstructions in the right direction. Okay, so I'm going to talk. And by the way, Margaret, if there are questions, I can take them at this point.
I think we didn't instruct people to ask questions, so I mean, we can wait.
Okay, we can wait until the end then.
Or if someone has a question and can type them real quickly. some of our students work with this very similar setups with teacher-student models and are very interested in what you, oh, here's one.
Yeah.
I-
Okay, I'll go ahead and
I have a question from Nihal. Do using facial NERFs help?
using nerfs.
Yeah, nerfs.
Yeah, so this, of course, this work predates nerfs, but this is reconstruction from a single image, and that would be very challenging within the nerf framework. I mean, I think that nerfs have been shown fantastic results. And there's been a lot of work at trying to do reconstructions with a small number of images. But I don't think that I mean, there's so many papers on nerfs, I know that I'm not familiar with all of them. But I think it would still be challenging to deal with just a single image like this.
All right, great. No more
Okay.
questions so far.
Okay, so so after this, we did some work to extend this work to deal with indoor scenes instead of faces. And well, let me say the thing that's really much more challenging about indoor scenes is that everything is just much more complex. The lighting is more complex. The geometry is harder. Faces all have pretty much the same geometry, more or less. Scenes can have very wide ranges of geometry. So here's an example where when we use this direct lighting model, where we assume all the lights are distant, we don't get, this is just computer graphics, this is just for rendering, but rendering computer graphics with direct lighting doesn't work so well for scenes. And here we see rendering which is more realistic, where the lighting is not is changing everywhere. It can be different in different parts of the scene, and you can see all these effects that are very different with realistic lighting than with distant lighting. And so the main challenge and here's some other examples where the direct lighting model assumes all the lighting are very distant from the face. It's okay for faces, but for a scene like this, the light could be very close to one part of the wall and very far from another part of the wall. Cast shadows can be a much bigger deal in complex scenes, and material properties of the scenes vary a lot more. And so we can have some very shiny metal or marble surfaces and things like that. And so we can't just get away with using these simple lighting models to handle these more complex scenes. And this is just illustrating that, yeah, the objects in scenes tend to, they're not just Lambert-Eaton, they're not just diffuse. There's a lot of shiny materials here. And so estimating the reflectance properties of materials is much more complicated. And so the main idea of this work, so one way you could try to do this, which is pretty challenging, is to just use a very realistic rendering model. And that's hard because realistic rendering is very complex. It's not inherently differentiable, although there's some interesting work on differentiable rendering now. But accurately reconstructing a 3D scene so that you can render it with an accurate rendering model and use a reconstruction loss is quite challenging. And so instead of doing that, what we did was train a network to try to predict which parts of the image are not going to be handled by a simple rendering model. So we learn the parts of the image that contain complicated lighting effects. We don't try to model those lighting effects. We just try to learn, oh, these lighting effects are going to be hard to model, and so we're not going to try. So the idea is that we have a direct renderer, and then we have this other network, which we call RAR, which is predicting which parts of the image are not going to be handled by the direct renderer. And this is the RAR architecture, but I won't go through the details of the architecture. This is residual appearance renderer. So it's coming up with all the residuals, all the things that can't be handled by direct rendering. And so the idea is that if we have a image, what the RAR network learns is that in this image, all of this lighting is actually going to be an effect based on that's going to be difficult to model directly, right? And so it sort of learns that, oh, this is probably a uniform material, and this variation in appearance is due to lighting effects, or this appearance down here near the light source, this is also due to lighting effects. And so RAR predicts a residual, and then we do a reconstruction, and the residual plus the reconstruction is what needs to approximate the initial image. And so we use a reconstruction loss where we've reconstructed the image with a simple lighting model and simple materials, and with a network that predicts everything else that we weren't able to reconstruct with these simple models. So if we try to do this, so this is an ablation study where if we try to do this without RAR, what happens is the albedo has all these lighting effects embedded in it. And when we use RAR, it's able to predict that features of the image like this are due to lighting. They can't be reconstructed easily, but they can be removed from the image, and we get a reconstruction that's much more free of lighting effects. And here's another example where without RAR, we have a lot of lighting effects embedded in the albedo. And so for example, we can see a lot of lighting effects here, and those effects are not in the albedo when we use RAR, because RAR is able to predict that, oh, these are lighting effects. And similarly, you can see that the effects of the shadow are diminished here, although the result isn't perfect also, and there's some of the shadow still remains in the albedo. Okay, and so the key idea here is when we're trying to do reconstruction with very complicated lighting effects, instead of trying to model everything, we just try to predict what part is going to be hard to model, and then don't try to model it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple more pieces of work a little more briefly. So this is work that was done with my student Cutilia, and also my former student Hao, who was at Amazon at the time, is now at Google. And this was a new method for trying to combine synthetic and real data. So this takes a different approach. In the previous two pieces of work, we used synthetic data. They both use synthetic data in the same way. We train a network with synthetic data. This gives us kind of a coarse solution, and we can use that to disambiguate the results of just using a reconstruction loss. In this work, we take a different tack on trying to combine synthetic and real data. And the basic idea here is that we can try to convert synthetic and real data into a common domain where we can train on both of them. And so this has been inspired by a lot of previous work where, for example, people take synthetic images and then train a network to try to make them look more real. Or in some cases, people take real images and try to make them look more synthetic so that they can be reconstructed using networks that are just trained on synthetic data. So if you can make the synthetic data look real, then you're training your network on stuff that seems pretty real, but you have labels. And if you can take real data and make it look synthetic, then you can apply a network that was just trained on synthetic data to try to understand those real images, because now they look synthetic. And the idea of this work is that those approaches, while interesting, are maybe trying to solve a problem that's unnecessarily difficult, because it can be hard to make synthetic data look really real. There may be aspects of the real images that are very hard to reproduce. And it can be hard to make real images look perfectly synthetic also. But maybe we don't actually need to do that. All we need to do is map them into the synthetic and real into a common domain. And then we can train our networks on both synthetic and real data, and apply them to synthetic and real data. And so the idea here is that this is just a very schematic drawing, but the blue here is meant to be synthetic. The orange here is meant to be real. And when we have synthetic and real data of the same, images of the same scene, there's going to be some part of those images that is shared between the two, that is basically the same. And then there's going to be some part that's different. There's going to be some ways in which the synthetic data is different from the real data. And of that, parts of the synthetic image that are different from real, some of them are necessary to solve the reconstruction problem, but some of them are maybe irrelevant. So for example, if we're reconstructing the face, somebody's hair may not be really relevant. And so there's no point in wasting effort trying to make synthetic hair look real when it's not used in the reconstruction anyway. And so the intuition behind sharing GAN is we're going to try to make the synthetic and real closer to each other, but we're only going to focus on those parts of the images that are necessary for reconstruction. And so we do this by training a network that can take either synthetic or real images. There's an encoder-decoder architecture that produces transformed synthetic or transformed real images. This is called sharing GAN because we use an adversarial kind of network where we have a discriminator that tries to make sure that the synthetic and the real have been brought together. So the discriminator provides a loss if it can tell the difference between the synthetic and the real. So we're trying to transform the synthetic and real so that the network can't tell the difference between synthetic and real anymore. This feeds into our primary network, which is performing the downstream task that we want to perform. And this downstream task is only using some of the information in the synthetic and the real. And so because we're connected to this downstream task, we're only care about bringing together the synthetic and real components that are necessary for the downstream task. If there's parts of the synthetic and real images that are very different from each other, they can just be eliminated, right? There's no reason they need to be preserved. And the discriminator, if they're eliminated, the discriminator can't tell the difference between synthetic and real. But if they're not necessary to the downstream task, then eliminating them doesn't affect the primary network. And then we can supervise this either based on ground truth labels from synthetic data or some kind of virtual supervision, pseudo labels for the real data. Okay, we've applied this to monocular depth estimation and to face recognition, face reconstruction. And I'll just show how we did this for face reconstruction. So this was solving the same problem that SFSNet, the first paper I talked about, was solving, where the primary network here is the network, the primary network from SFSNet, but now we're taking the synthetic and the real images and trying to bring them together into a common domain. And then we're training SFSNet to use that representation of the images. And when we do this, we get an improvement over SFSNet. So this is showing the mean average error of the surface normals, and this is showing accuracy on lighting reconstruction. And so both of these improve over SFSNet. It's not a huge improvement, but the method is very generic. And so we can apply this method to a wide range of different reconstruction problems. And we did this for 2, and in both we saw a small but significant improvement in performance. Okay, so I'm going to talk about one more reconstruction problem. In the previous reconstruction work, we were using a single image to reconstruct a face or a scene. And here we're aiming to reconstruct a 3D object, but as accurately as possible. And unlike the previous work, we're going to use a few images instead of just a single image. And this is work again with Daniel Lichi, who's shown here also, who's my current grad student, and also Jai Wu worked on this, and Sumyadeep Sengupta also helped out a lot. So Jai is also a grad student at Maryland right now. And this is University of Washington affiliation, because Sumyadeep is a postdoc at UW when we did this work. And so photometric stereo is a classic problem. The idea is that if you have images of an object under different lighting conditions, then that really constrains the 3D structure of the object. And you can get much more accurate and more detailed reconstructions. And one of the main ideas of this work was to make the capture process very simple. So in a lot of photometric stereo, you need a kind of laboratory setup where you know exactly, you have calibrated lights and maybe a lot of images. And the idea of this work was to see if we could get reconstruction using uncalibrated or very loosely calibrated images and a relatively small number of images. And the other main insight of this work, which I'll talk about in a minute, was how to build high resolution reconstructions. So the idea of this work was to capture images by just having whatever ambient light you want, and then taking images with a flashlight. And so we can do image subtraction and just figure out what this object would look like if it was only illuminated by the flashlight. And so we get basically a single point source image, an image with a single light source. And we take this with the light from a few different directions. So Daniel's pointing the light in from the right, the front right, from the direction of the camera itself, to the front left, the left, and above. So there's only 6 images here. And I'm saying that this is loosely calibrated because, he's trying to hold the light above the skull, but he's probably only within a few degrees of being right above it. So there's going to be variation in exactly where the lighting is. And so the idea is this is a nice compromise between roughly knowing where the lighting is and real ease of use. Okay, so here's an example of the results of this. This is a 3D reconstruction that we're able to obtain, and it's pretty detailed. And in particular, if we look at the teeth here, you can see that there's a lot of detail in the 3D reconstruction. This is just showing relighting this with different light sources. And so the main insight of this was how to recover high resolution details of the image. So one way you can try to get high resolution is to train with high resolution images and then test with high resolution images. And the problem with that is that it's very computationally expensive, and we want something that's easy to use. So you can also train on low resolution images and test on high resolution images. If you use a fully convolutional network, then you can apply your network to arbitrary image sizes, but this tends to produce poor results when we train on low resolution and test on high resolution. And the reason for this is So this is showing an example where we have an input image, we train a network to do reconstruction, and then we, using low resolution images, we have ground truth normals, and then we look at the reconstruction for input images of varying resolution. And what you can see is this works fine if we train on low resolution images and test on low resolution images. But if we test on high resolution images, we get poor results. And the reason for that is that there's just not enough context. I mean, to understand the surface normals at the bottom of this prism, you need to have a field of view. You need the network to be looking at a region that's larger than just this flat planar region. And so the intuition behind what we call RecNet, a recursive network architecture, is instead of conditioning the reconstruction just on the image, we do things at multiple scales, and we reconstruct the object at a particular resolution, conditioned on the image at that resolution and a reconstruction at a slightly lower resolution. And so we do this over and over again, and every time we pass through the network, we're just reconstructing at a little bit higher resolution. And so we're just polishing what we've already got at the lower resolution. And so the way this works is we begin with a low resolution. We train a network to just initialize based on low resolution. Then we take that reconstruction, we use a higher resolution image, and we feed both of those through RecNet and produce a higher resolution reconstruction. And then we keep doing this. We take that higher resolution reconstruction and an even higher resolution image, and we produce a higher a 128 by 128 reconstruction. Then we take that, we use a 256 by 256 image, and we get a reconstruction at 256 by 256. And we can keep doing this as long as we want and get higher and higher resolution reconstructions. And so we can very efficiently produce, take a high resolution set of images, produce a high resolution reconstruction by just passing through this recursive network. And so this is showing, for the prism example, that with this recursive network, we get excellent reconstruction. And here are some comparisons to other pieces of work, and you can see that we get accurate and pretty detailed reconstructions of the shape. And this is an example, a comparison with the skull. Okay. So I didn't really expect to get to this piece of work. I'm gonna skip over this. But I think the main points of this work are we've got to think about how to make use of real images as well as synthetic images in reconstruction. Training just on synthetic images doesn't tend to produce good results. But at the same time, there are a bunch of different strategies for combining synthetic and real data that can be used to get sort of all the advantages of real data, the high resolution details, but also gain from using the synthetic data. Okay, thanks very much, and I'll stop here in case there are any questions.
All right, David, thank you so much. You hit the sweet point in giving us a breadth of your work and also going deep enough. So we learned a lot. I really enjoyed this. And I want to encourage people to type their questions. And while people are typing, maybe I can start with my first one. So I myself work on 3D reconstruction, but in our work, we don't need the kind of details that you're providing with your work, where you have these beautiful, detailed facial structures or structures of a room. So in our work, we're doing pose estimation for humans or animals. And although people have done pose estimation for like a full shape of a human body, that's not so interesting for us. We're more interested in sort of the skeleton or key points on the animal to kind of know what they're doing with their body. So I was thinking maybe your sharing, Gian, could be used for that also for us, where, I mean, we have to deal with video, we have lots of different poses, and instead of trying to kind of cover the whole face or the whole room, instead, we're just trying to cover patches on the body for which we get the normals and, you know, deal with the lighting. And I just wanted to get your feedback on that. And you did show, you had like a cat, right, with key points at the very beginning of your talk. So I wonder if you actually have done some work on animal pose also.
Yeah. So we've done some work on animal pose. So with animals in particular, it's difficult to get a lot of data.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there are good computer graphics models now. I mean, with humans, you can get pretty good computer graphics for human pose. But for animals, I don't know if that's available. It's probably harder to get. So we had this work, and this was actually based on measuring a bunch of toy animals and building a kind of morphable model from a fairly small number of examples. But I think the real challenge, we also did some work on finding features on birds, and it was a while ago. I'm sure that's not state of the art anymore. I think this is, this is a great problem. I think the real challenge is figuring out how to use real data when the animals can be so complex in their pose.
Mm-hmm.
With something like a hippopotamus, actually, the range of pose is not so bad, but with birds, it's quite challenging.
Yeah,
I'm not
the
sure.
reason I was bringing up the sharing again was because I could imagine that there's quite complex features with the birds, but you might not be interested in all of them, right? So if you in that work could sort of focus on the information that you care about, then maybe it's more doable.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, but only if you can get some computer graphics that would be kind of reasonable.
Yeah. Well, maybe there's this other idea of yours that you had with the recursive improvement could be done too, where for the initial steps you use a relatively poor computer graphic model because you don't have a very detailed one for the animal, and then in the later steps maybe you you don't have the graphical model, but maybe you can do some other trick to refine what you need. Yeah. All right, so while we were chatting, a question showed up by an anonymous attendee. Is it particularly difficult because of their hair texture? So what exactly is particularly difficult? The reconstruction of the animals? Is that what the attendee might?
Yeah, so in this work, we kind of punted on hair, and we're really not trying to reconstruct hair. I think that is a really difficult problem. So here we were just reconstructing sort of this part of the face, which is largely free of hair. Yeah, hair would be much harder. I also don't, probably also the computer graphics, not quite as good. It's more challenging also. That would be my guess.
Mhm. All right, are there other questions? What I also loved was the way your networks are really separating the reconstruction from the lighting from the albedo, so that way you can tease apart what works well and what doesn't, and and then improve on the different parts, right?
Yeah.
And also, since we're still sort of teaching all these traditional things in computer vision classes, when people see that it's actually really useful to know what photometric stereo means, and these different pieces. It's nice to see that in the modern context. All right, so we got another question from Nihal. Can this be used for autonomous driving? What's the state of the art for autonomous driving? Connection to your work, I guess.
Yeah, so this is definitely a big problem with autonomous driving, particularly this monocular depth estimation. Of course, with autonomous driving, you also have LiDAR and other things, but to get depth at a distance, this is a significant problem. And I think the results are pretty good. There's a lot of work. They're very realistic computer graphics models for this that generate quite realistic 3D scenes with known depth, and they've been used pretty heavily. So it's, this problem in particular is really motivated by autonomous driving and uses graphics models that were developed for autonomous driving.
All right, yeah, thanks. That's also interesting to see. Are there more questions? No. Oh, well then, I'm just very thankful for your talk. Thank you so much. It was really interesting, and we wish you the best, and we'll be in touch.
Yep.
All right,
Thanks,
thank you
everybody.
very much, David. Bye, everybody.